Hello, everybody. Sorry that we started just a minute or two late. We had a few technical glitches, but we are off to the races now. This is our very first webinar for our new event, the official event of Faith and Finance, Reimagining God's Economy. It's been a long time in coming, and this event has been my imagination for a decade, but I didn't imagine we'd be doing this as a webinar. Most of you know that we had announced this event long before the COVID-19 pandemic and begun to sell tickets. In fact, many of you on this call are the people who bought those early tickets. If it were not for you and your early support, this wouldn't be happening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rosalie Harden. I'm an Episcopal priest, and I'm also one of the founders of SoCap, the global event about impact investing and social entrepreneurship. The original slogan and the continuing slogan for SoCap was the conference at the intersection of money and meaning. And every time I got on the stage at SoCap, I would think this room should be packed with clergy and people of faith who want to put their money where their values are. The church should be leading this movement. For a lot of reasons, such as not wanting SoCap to be a Christian event or an event of just one faith, and the economic model for SoCap made it impossible for SoCap to be accessible to the average church member. So we needed to find a different way. So thanks to leadership education at Duke Divinity School, the United Methodist Development Fund, Trinity Wall Street, and Christ Church Cathedral in Cincinnati, and all of our ticket buyers, we were able to imagine and now produce this ongoing series of events, Faith plus Finance, Reimagining God's Economy. As I mentioned, this is just the first of many. On June the 3rd, Eve Poole, a popular and influential theologian and economist who's been studying and writing about faith and finance for the Church of England for more than a decade, will talk with us about her conclusions from her book, Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions. The chat box for you as we go on how to sign up for that event if you have not already done so. There will also be an email coming to you when this is over with all of that information. And if you're on an iPad and you can't use that feature, like I said, you'll be getting that through email. Then on June the 12th, again, the info will be in the chat box. Ross Baird, who is a SoCap superstar who founded Village Capital, it put millions of dollars into the social entrepreneurship ecosystem globally. Ross will be in conversation with two people who are involved in his new work, Blueprint Local. David Robinson Jr., who leads Blueprint's work in San Antonio, and his father, a real superstar, an NBA Hall of Famer, David Robinson Sr., who has been connecting faith and finance and education in the center of San Antonio for 2 decades. You don't want to miss those sessions. They're going to be great. Past that, we're going to be launching what's already looking like a very exciting conversation about assets in transition, about church properties that are now dormant or underutilized and how to better use them. We're going to be launching book clubs about the books that we'll be talking about here today and more, and even a preaching series with spotlights on Christian social entrepreneurs. We're audacious in our goal of not just having a conference, but just as SoCap did with Investing for Good, we want to shift the landscape. We want to start a movement. Especially now with this pandemic, the wealth gap is increasing and the stakes are getting even higher. The church cannot continue to say talking about money is impolite. The church must find her voice. So now we're going to begin in just a second with two people who have been so influential in this space, Jed Emerson and Edgar Villanueva. But I do want you to know before they talk that following their talk, Mark Sampson of Rooted Good, Reggie Blunt of Garrett Theological Seminary, and Kenda Creasy Dean of Princeton Seminary will be responding to what Jed and Edgar have to say and having a conversation with Jed and Edgar and answering questions. So you don't want to miss that. Now I'm going to turn the screen over to Sarah Menard. Sarah has been a major part of the Faith and Finance team since we started coordinating our impact investing track and working across all the areas. She teaches an award-winning course on impact investments at Babson College. Has been in this for 20 years working on sustainable solutions to poverty and gender inequality. She's also CEO of Manoury, a global consulting firm. Just a second, I'm going to ask her to give proper introductions to Jed and Edgar, but quickly, one last reminder, the Q&A box at the top of your screen is where you can join in by asking questions, and we will get them to our panelists. And the chat thread is where you can ask ordinary questions about what's going on or get more information about what's next with Faith and Finance. Thank you so much. Now let's turn this over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rosalie, and welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you with us today. Jed Emerson is an author and strategic advisor to family offices, wealth management firms around the world, executing diverse approaches to investing for financial returns with social and environmental impact. He's a co-author of the first ever book on impact investing, as well as 6 other books on impact investing and social entrepreneurship. He's been active in both fields for nearly 30 years. In the late 90s, he coined the concept blended value, some of you might know. It's intended to describe the value we create in our lives and through our investing as a blend of social, environmental, and economic elements. This concept and his prolific speaking and writing, including his new book, The Purpose of Capital: Elements of Impact, Financial Flows, and Natural Being, challenge everyone to think about money and investing differently, seeing it as the total integrated value of our lives and the world. A senior research fellow at the University of Heidelberg Center on Social Investing, Jed has held faculty appointments at Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford Business School, currently resides between New York City and the Colorado Rockies, where he will be coming in from. Edgar Villanueva is a globally recognized expert on social justice philanthropy and author of the award-winning book, Decolonizing Wealth, offering hopeful and compelling alternatives to the dynamics of colonization in the philanthropic and social finance sectors. In addition to working in philanthropy for many years, Edgar has consulted with numerous nonprofit organizations and national and global philanthropies on advancing racial equity inside their institutions and through their investment strategies. He is the chair of the board of Native Americans in Philanthropy and senior vice president of programs and advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Edgar holds 2 degrees from the Gillings Global School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is an enrolled member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina and currently resides in Brooklyn. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Sarah.
We're going to begin with both Jed and Edgar reflecting on an open question that I will pose to them both as really the starting point, the launching pad for their 15-minute talk about their books. So Jed and Edgar, given both of your books extensively research and discuss some of our biggest questions as a human society, what it means to be a whole being, the social, spiritual, political, economic ideas and practices, including racism, sexism, colonization that have shaped our relationships with nature and money and privilege and each other, from ancient history up to today. I thought we would start differently with this initial question. We'd start off with a more personal one. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about the religious and the spiritual background of your childhoods, however you would define that now. And I'll add maybe how that might have informed your writing of these fascinating and incredibly important and timely books. So Jed, I'll start with you. As you mentioned in The Purpose of Capital, you are the son and grandson of Presbyterian ministers.
Yes, I am. And before I talk about all that, I'd like to just begin by thanking everybody who's taken the time to participate in this conversation with us. I think it's going to be a really exciting couple of hours, and I appreciate your taking the time to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Ute Mountain people in northern Colorado. And I would like to acknowledge that as I place us within the context of this conversation. I can also, as I'm sitting here, look across a ravine out the window over the Colorado River toward Bussey Hill, which is where my family had a property back in the early 1970s, and is really kind of the coming together for me in terms of my family history and my history of connecting to this area. My grandfather was the senior pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. My father was the pastor of 3 different parishes in New York, in Denver, and in San Francisco. My mom was a social worker. My grandmother was a ruling elder of a Presbyterian church in New York City, where in the 1940s, where in the 1980s, I became also a ruling elder. And so in many ways, I feel like I was really bred to do community work and be involved in these conversations. I think that what happened for me in that process is that I had a lot of takeaways from that experience, but one of the most important was this sense of community and connection, and that we are all really accountable and responsible, each to the other. And it's important that we keep that in mind as we go through life. And that was really just a foundational value that my family had and that I was taught. And I think the challenge for many of us is that we're actually brought into a world that is bifurcated. In American society in particular, we're asked to accept the idea that you have to choose. You have to either do good or do well. You work for a nonprofit or a for-profit. You make an investment or you make a gift. And this is how our lives evolve. And yet this bifurcated understanding of value, it really stands in contrast with how most of us actually experience life and community and family and faith. And I would argue that in truth, value is not bifurcated. Value is fundamentally whole. It is non-divisible. And what we have done as humanity, what we have done in Western culture, and in specifically in our understanding of modern financial capitalism, has been to build a set of social constructs based and premised on this bifurcation. And so before we can really talk about wealth and talk about money, we have to talk about issues of separation of self from other, because the way that we think about the purpose of capital today is really popularly understood to be simply a question of aggregating more capital. The purpose of capital is to make more money. Whereas if we step back and really reflect on how that evolved, how that understanding of the purpose of capital came to be, it really is the legacy, it's the inheritance that we have from centuries of other people who have brought their cultural assumptions, their values, their beliefs to this social construct of capital that we have inherited. And it's really up to each generation to reflect on how did we get here and what are our beliefs for today and how do we want to arrange and describe the purpose of our capital for our times. When we think about how did we get here, how did we begin with this sense of separation? Was this always the case? I would argue that it has not always been the case. And from our backgrounds and traditions in the Western side, we really can see that in fact, we originally in the Christian tradition thought about the paradise. We thought about the Garden of Eden. We thought about a time when we walked with God, if you will. And in Greek and Roman ancient traditions, there's the idea of the Golden Age, where mortals and gods walked together on the earth. And when we think about how this separation occurred, there are many different traditions and understandings for how that break happened. One of them is offered us by Noah Harari, the historian, who talks about the cognitive revolution as that point in time when we developed as a species the neurological capacity for thought and reflection and consciousness. And it was at that point where I, as an entity, became separate from you and from my community. If we go further, we could also think about the Axial Age, which was a period that scholars debate today, but is thought to have occurred between 300 and 800 BCE, when we as people moved off of the plains, moved out of tribal structures and into the urban areas. And the ways that we thought, the ways that we understood religion, faith, community, connection became heavily challenged as we created new social orders that were included the armies, the merchants, the religious orders, and that this further divided us from ourselves. And many of the things that came after that then were processes of our trying to reconnect, of trying to become more whole as we know we're called to be. We go forward then many centuries to the 1600s and you have the Enlightenment. And of course, that's well known for the period of Western dualism and the whole framing of the idea of the material versus the spiritual self. I think, therefore I am. And that framing came up just at the time that capitalism evolved itself. And so in 1604, we see the creation of the first joint stock company, the Dutch East India Group, and shares were sold in order to diversify risk and bring new capital into financing the expedition to the Dutch East Indies. The expedition set out in 1604 and returned several years later, was thought to be very successful. And in the days after the return of the expedition, it was discovered that upon arrival in the Dutch East Indies, what the expedition discovered was that all of the good spots had been taken by the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish. And so, as any good entrepreneur would do, the Dutch engaged in piracy, in warfare, and in fact, went and took the goods and returned them on their expedition and were celebrated. And when they returned, there was a group of Mennonites who began to reflect on this and said, wait a minute, the premise that we had invested has been betrayed. We had invested on the basis of trade, and you engaged in war. And you had, in the one case, one Mennonite sold his shares to protest what had happened. And in the other case, you had another Mennonite who engaged in a multi-year campaign against the governors of the Dutch East India Group in order to protest what had happened. And so at the very beginning of modern capitalism, we have this tension in place between the parts, between the moral and the money. And this then brought itself forward over many other centuries, of course, and manifests in different ways. But in the 1960s, you see the situation where we have war and we have environmental degradation, and more investors began to say, wait a minute, my values, who I am in the world, how I want to be in the world is not in alignment with the wealth that I'm managing and a steward of. And so you saw then, again, the Mennonites and different Catholic orders come forward and begin to say, we're going to screen out the negative. We're going to take away the things that are bad in our portfolio because they don't reflect the value we want to create in the world. In the 80s, you saw then the South Africa divest movement, which became then that generation's period of removing and screening out the bad. And as that was successful, people began to say, well, wait a minute, if there are bad companies in a portfolio, could there be good companies? And what would it look like to execute a best-in-class strategy? And so these actors then began to invest on that basis. And we began to see then the ESG practices and ultimately ESG integration, by which I mean environmental, social, and governance. And that coming into practice in the 80s and in the 90s as people began to say, there actually are ways that we can manage our wealth, manage our capital to create the world that we really want to see. And in the 90s and in the aughts, you then saw a new generation of wealth holders who'd created their wealth. They had not been inheritors of wealth. And they said, look, I want to draw as short a line as possible between the deployment of my capital and the creation of community and environmental impact. And those folks became, the first of what became called impact investors. But in truth, all of our capital creates impact. All companies that we manage create impacts in the world. And the issue is not whether or not you have impact, but rather, are you managing your impact with intentionality and in alignment with the type of world that we want to live in and with the values that you would like to bring forward as you manifest in the world itself. What's been interesting to watch in this evolution, in the recent period of the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years, there's been, I think, a growing interest and focus specifically in the element of what's left. A lot of the conversations around impact investing and sustainable finance, ESG integration, has really focused on how to do this. What are the strategy and tactics by which we execute? And there's been less of a focus on why. Why should we do this? How do we understand, again, the purpose, meaning, and values? And so I think you've had a crew of investors who have now started asking much more deeply profound questions. And to my mind, they're asking issues around mutual impact and the idea that actually as an investor, I can become as transformed in the process of investing as those who I seek to have transformation together with. And impact investing and the way we manage our wealth is not simply about what we do to others, what we do in markets and in communities and around the world, in ecosystems, but also how am I affected by that? How am I transformed by the relationship that I have with wealth and by my relationship with others in our community and in our world? And I'm going to close with a quote that was sent to me recently. Richard Rohr, the Franciscan theologian, has written Saint Bonaventure, who lived from 1221 to 1274, taught that Christ as a human being shares with all creatures. Indeed, he possesses being with rocks, lives among the plants, senses with animals, and understands the angels, close quote. In saying this, Bonaventure wanted to give theological weight to the deep experience of St. Francis of Assisi, who, as far as we know, was the first recorded Christian to call animals and elements and even the forces of nature by familial names: Sister Mother Earth, Brother Wind, Sister Water, and Brother Fire. And so I would argue that in many ways we've come full circle, and we've gone through this evolution from a place of separation and brokenness toward a time when we are seeking greater and greater wholeness and, in essence, a unified, holistic understanding of mission, purpose, and value that seeks to integrate and weave together who we are and how we are in the world. And I think it's fascinating that I have the pleasure to be in this conversation today with Edgar, who will walk us through a whole nother cultural perspective about wholeness and separation and how these all come together in our relationship with wealth. But at that point, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Jed, thank you so much. What an incredibly rich contribution. I'm sure we have a lot of questions and comments to that incredible talk. Edgar, turning to you, in Decolonizing Wealth, you speak about Christianity through the lens of colonization, but also you mention your close relationship with your mom, who really walked the talk about love thy neighbor in the Christian sense, and really expected the same of you, as you noticed and you wrote in your book. Can you tell us about your religious or spiritual background and how it's informed who you are and why you wrote the book, and how it's informed your voice in Decolonizing Wealth?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Jed. It's an honor to be on the panel with you today. And greetings to everyone who's watching this presentation today. I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn. This is the unceded territory of the Lenape tribe, and I'm honored to be here. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story today about my life as an Indigenous person who has been navigating inside many of these systems, inside places of faith and religion, and also inside places of philanthropy and social investment. I grew up in North Carolina. I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe, which is the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi River. And my family found religion. My grandfather was the first to become a born-again Christian, and he was a person who completely, upon finding religion, completely dedicated his life to Christ and spent any free moment he had doing jail ministry in North Carolina. He had such a compassion for people who were incarcerated. And from his introduction to the church, my mother, as a result, was a part of the church. And I grew up in the church. I used to joke around saying that I was a drug addict. And what I meant by that is that I was drugged to church my entire life, from Sunday morning, Sunday night, Saturday night prayer meeting, Wednesday night Bible study. We were a part of a denomination called the United Pentecostal Church, or the UPC, which it was and I think still is, a relatively conservative evangelical type of denomination. And there were many things that the church provided to me as a young person in terms of discipline, structure, support for our family. Absolutely, the church instilled in me a sense of service, obligation, giving, understanding that what I had was not my own, but that it belonged to God. And so those were some of the teachings from very early on that I really appreciated. My mom carried on that tradition of service from my grandfather, and she had a great passion for children, and she launched a bus ministry in our community in Raleigh, North Carolina. And every Saturday morning, we went out on visitation and invited children from the neighborhood to come to church. And on Sunday mornings, we would go out and pick them up on a bus. And at a certain point in time, my mom was busing in hundreds of children to church every Sunday morning. And I learned and understood early on that although we were poor and lacking for a lot of material things, there were always folks who had it a little bit worse. And it was my place and my calling to help those in need. My sense for service and my desire to make change in the world led me to seminary right after high school. And I went to a Pentecostal seminary, a very small school in Jackson, Mississippi, and studied theology, studied Black gospel music. And really there, I had such a transformative experience around understanding what my calling was in life. I learned by the end of my time in seminary that I was not going to be a minister in an ordained kind of traditional route, but that there were other places that I would make a difference in the world. But I was forever transformed by having 3 years of time to really devote myself to study of the Bible and religion, and really learning to become a minister, how to connect to people, how to listen, how to understand, how to be empathetic and supportive of others in their ups and downs of life. So as I came into adulthood, had to find my own place, my own understanding of who I was as a person, my own spirituality, what I believed. Coming from a denomination and a faith tradition that was very literal, took the Bible very, very literal, very strong articles of faith, ideology around separation from the world and holiness. There was very much an assimilation kind of process as a part of that church, where you were expected to dress a certain way, to carry yourself a certain way. Some folks may recognize the word holiness. It was a holiness church. And for me, I think as an Indigenous person, being the only Native American in our church, in my school, in my community, I completely became sort of colonized, as you might say, and assimilated to the ideology and the values of this faith community. That's in some ways reinforced ideas at times about us versus them, and how we were to come out and be separate from the world. And so this ideology around separation was something that I think I struggled with later in life as I was trying to shift my thinking and really begin to decolonize how I showed up in the world and my worldview. That led me, into adulthood on a journey of really an identity crisis. And then I find myself working in the space of philanthropy, which is this sector that has an inherent amount of power and privilege. And being from my background of poverty and being Indigenous and finding myself working in that space, it was a whole nother ideology and identity that I grappled with, wanting to go about doing good work, lots of good intentions, but there were a lot of contradictions and complexities in the space. I will say that faith for me has been the underpinning for everything that I have done in my work. It is very mission related, and still really remains strong and drives what I do today. But yet I would be lying if I didn't say that I did not have numerous painful experiences as a result of being a part of faith communities at times. And I've also had painful experiences working inside the space of philanthropy. And those painful experiences are what really drove me to write a book. I set out through my own quest for healing to explore what I really believed about myself, and to really try to dive into Indigenous spirituality and open my mind to believe something different, and to explore the role of philanthropy and money in the world. And once I began to understand that the stories that have been taught to me were optional, and that the choices that we often make and the choices I have made are optional, we can choose to let go of beliefs, any beliefs that limit us. Every obstacle can be incorporated to become an ally, another beautiful aspect of authentic wholeness. A free imagination is key to overcoming limited beliefs. And so for me, the central question around much of the work that I do is what if? And I think that what if as is a legitimate tool to really imagine healing, to imagine reconstructing a world, and just asking the question of what if opens us up to a radically different possibility for reality that can lead to healing and a greater sense of dignity and purpose. I began to understand that the ideology of white supremacy was a story that had just been made up. That the ideology I had internalized around capitalism and resources being scarce and limited were stories that had been made up and taught to me. And I began this journey to really understand indigenous teachings and values, such as like all my relations, like really opening my mind to believe that we are really related, that our interdependence is interconnected, and the decisions that I make impact you, and the decisions that I make today actually impact 7 generations down the road. The ideology of reciprocity, that I give to you and care for you because I know you're going to do the same for me. These were not new ideas for me per se, but as I really opened my mind and submitted myself to indigenous wisdom and teaching for my community, I began this process of decolonizing myself and really shifting my worldview from one that was very assimilated to the ideas of separation, individualism, to a place of thinking about ourselves very differently. This led me in my work to ask questions about money and to really wonder, about that scripture in the Bible that I often heard growing up, that the love of money was the root of all evil. And I find myself as an adult coming into my sort of new spiritual self and working with money and running into barriers for using that money in a way that I thought was most impactful in communities, and wondering if this was the right space for me to be in. And during the time of writing the book, I had this amazing encounter with an elder who said to me that, Edgar, the medicine that has chosen you is money. And at first I didn't quite understand what that meant. Like, how could money be medicine, and why did it choose me? As I really dove into that and sat with that for months to come, I began to look back in our history and understand the history of colonization in the United States, and how that violent force of dividing, conquering, exploiting, oppressing folks, many times in the name of God, was very connected to the accumulation of wealth and ideas of hoarding and of harming people and of harming the planet, all in the name of amassing wealth. And understanding that history of colonization had bred in me and in many others ideas of fear and scarcity and blame, which all arise when we think that we're not in this thing together, this thing called life. I began to understand that colonization was like a virus. And I talk about the colonizer virus and the ideology behind colonization, how it is still very much present. It's not a thing of history. It's something that we still see in our policies. We see the colonizer virus in our public education system, and we absolutely see the colonizer virus at play in the ways that we use money, and we see in the ways that we invest money. I now believe in truth more than ever, and calling things as they are, not in a way to throw people under the bus or to make people feel bad about themselves, but I think for all of us to get to a true place of healing, we have to name things as they are, and we have to be respectful to the history and understand and ask the hard questions about where wealth came from in the first place, and acknowledge that wealth has been built for the most part in this country on the backs of people of color and through very violent acts of slavery and genocide and stolen land. I believe as a person of faith in the power of truth and reconciliation. And as I tapped into indigenous wisdom and began to understand ideas around restorative justice and healing, I began to understand that I, as a Native person, had internalized colonization, that I could decolonize my mind and my thinking, and as a process of healing to come into my true self of identity. And in doing so, I could find forgiveness for others and grace for the journey that others may be on. The idea of restorative justice is something that is deeply rooted in Indigenous wisdom, and it's also deeply rooted in spirituality. And so I've been on a path to embrace those ideas and to embrace the idea of both and, right? The world is complicated. How can I be a Christian and be Native American at the same time, right? These are ideas that we grapple with in a linear way of thinking that I've chosen to disband and to accept the fact that I can be all the things all at the same time. So I move into a close here. I just want to say that as this pertains to money in the spaces of philanthropy, wealth management, social impact investing that I work now, I often think about how to use money in a way that is respectful to our racist history in this country. I want you to understand today, if nothing else, my definition of poverty. Poverty is a product of public policy and theft that has been facilitated by white supremacy. And so in our efforts to use money in a different way to alleviate poverty, to dismantle poverty, we must use money to change public policy, right? Like intentional public policy has led to poverty. We must change policy, and we must acknowledge the theft that has taken place. So I'm in support of moving massive amounts of capital back into communities of color, and doing so in a way that dismantles white supremacy that has facilitated colonization and has facilitated the racial wealth gap that we now see. This is beyond just making some good grants or making some good investments. We need to move serious chunks of capital back into communities of color in a way that supports and respects self-determination of those communities to use that wealth to drive their own solutions. I have asked for a tithing. You'll see my Christian ideology coming into play here in some of the aspects of the book. But I think that foundations, for one, could take 10% of their endowments as a tithing and just hand that over to communities of color. I'm speaking beyond the grant making, right? We have a long ways to go to be equitable in our grant making. But again, to get to a place of transformation, to rapidly close the race wealth gap, we have to tap into those endowments and liberate that capital, like serious amounts of capital. And I think 10% as a tithing is a good place to start the conversation. And then the last thing I'll just say, I'm looking forward to hearing the responses and having Q&A with you, is that all of us have to think about using money differently, thinking about how can we use our resources for healing. And we know that the pain is the worst in communities of color. So if we're using money as medicine, we have to invest in and deploy capital to communities of color to support healing and at least to stop more harm from happening in those communities. Thank you.
Edgar, thank you so much for those incredibly important and valuable remarks. So useful and incredibly inspiring. We have wonderful questions in the queue, which I think I will turn to because the questions I had teed up for us, I think you both answered. So I think we'll move right to one of the questions from one of the participants. It said, you spoke about the value of the horizontal relationship the impact investor has with those she seeks to help. Could you speak on the potential impact of the vertical relationship the investor has with God and how that might influence her investing decisions? Edgar, why don't we start with you?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, for me, when I'm thinking of horizontal and vertical, I'm thinking of straight lines, and I'm just a person that thinks in circles. So even in my relationship with God, I see that as a reciprocal relationship. I live to worship the Creator. The spirit of the Creator is in me, and I am made in the Creator's image. So I see my relationship as one that is reciprocal and circular there, which is similar to my relationship with others. I don't see it as a straight line, but I do see it as a circular process of reciprocity And so I am in you and you are in me. I don't know if that quite explains it, but that's the way I imagine it.
That's terrific. Thank you. Jed, what do you think about that question?
Just as a softball question to start us off, I guess. I think that where you stand depends on where you sit. And so depending on your perspectives around faith and God and relationship and other, we will understand what it means to find God in our own reflections and our own efforts to to go higher, if you will. For me personally, I find God in others in relationship, as Edgar was saying. And so I think that you turn this around and you come on yourself. You find yourself in terms of how you represent, how you show up in the world. And as you do that in relationship with others, you discover more and more about not only yourself, but about the other and about the ultimate other. And so I think this is all this process of, again, moving around the wheel of life, if you will, in order to explore. And then the challenge is who I was and my experience of faith and justice as a 20-year-old community activist in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco is very different from who I was when I was running an impact fund with a major financier who was a billionaire, is extremely different from the life that I lead today. And yet they're all true in their own way. They're all parts of this process of both being and becoming. And I think that, one of the things that Edgar said that really resonated for me was this idea of thinking differently, that we have to call the question, as it were, and say that something is not right, something's not working. And that can be either my relationship with wealth and money is sick and needs healing. It can be how I use money to control and to engage in power in my relationships with others. And it can be money as a barrier to my own spiritual evolution and development and creation of a richer relationship with God. And so I think all of these things are part of the process of our kind of going deeper and higher in order to go forward with regard to evolving a new understanding around the purpose of capital.
Great. Thank you very much, Jed. We're going to turn to another question that we have from one of our participants. It says, you both use a refreshing approach in your work to be honest about the ugly history of our country and wealth and capital. Have you found the path forward since publishing your book easier or more difficult now that people know you do not prescribe traditional views of money, wealth, and investing?
Who should take that? Edgar, do you want to?
I guess I'll jump in. I would say that it's actually been easier for me. I think the message that we have today, this conversation, is one that the world has just been excited about and hungry for. And I think when I put the book out in 2018, I had no idea that I would be invited into all kinds of spaces, conservative, liberal, folks moving all different types amount of money with different ideologies and strategies. I think at the heart of it, we're all hungry for relationship, and the money is a proxy for, money is a proxy. I think what we want, and especially now during this time of COVID and the pandemic, where we are pushed to a limit and we see the fragility in systems, and there is a fear that is kind of inherent that people are holding because of what's happening in the world right now. I think that there's an openness to thinking about wealth and money in a different way. I also have, I work in the space of philanthropy where we have a super polite culture. And so I think that I get invited to spaces where people want to have the conversation. But, I have been in traditional banks and finance kind of places where the incentives may be upside down from how I see impact in some ways. But I think, again, I'm being invited in because there's an openness to want to think differently and use resources in a different way.
Well, I think on my part, I think it's gotten harder. I think that there's a phrase, you have to own your ugly, right? And that is a hard thing to do. I mean, to honestly kind of own yourself in that sense. And I think that, Edgar talked about white supremacy and the way that that kind of manifests. I always used to think about white supremacy as this, the skinheads with the, swastikas and the Confederate flags and all that kind of stuff. When you really look at the investor practices, and these are not Nazis, but the way that we allow people in, the way that we give people credit, the way that we give people the credit of the doubt. And it differs if you're white. It differs if you're a man. And that's racist. It is a white supremacist manifestation of racism in the practice of deploying capital. And so the problem is that I think we think about these issues and we say, wow, that's, I'm going to go talk to my black friend about what it's like to be black, right? This is not a conversation that we should be having with people of color. This is a white on white conversation. And it's really hard because, in impact investing, let's take as an example, we're all the good guys, right? We're here to change the world. We're putting our money to work. We're doing blended finance. We'll even take a haircut if we think that's justified. But would we ever really stop to just give up control and power and authority that comes with, managing and stewarding and being a fiduciary of capital? Of course not, right? We would never do that. That's crazy, right? But again, it's all part of this notion of the social construct that drives our understanding of not only the purpose of capital, but what's appropriate. What are we called to do as fiduciaries? And the thing that I think is striking for me is that there was a time in the state of New York where trustees of trusts in the state of New York were not allowed to invest in anything other than bonds issued by the state of New York. And it was not the state legislator that said, oh, we should open up the investing possibilities for fiduciaries. It was the fiduciaries who said, we have a broader responsibility to diversify our investment portfolios. And they pushed back and they challenged. And so this has always been a process of evolution and development where the wealthy have had to, in this context, really hear some very tough truths about what is happening, what the experiences are. And having heard, you can't really unring the bell. If you really hear what's going on, if you really open yourself up to what's happening in the world, you can't protect yourself anymore. And so you're on the one hand, you're forced to face your ugly and deal with it. And on the other hand, you have this incredible opportunity of self-liberation. I think that wealth holders and fiduciaries, and we're all in these roles. We're trapped in these boxes that expect us to perform certain ways. And so in some ways for me, writing the book was just hugely liberating. I think it was first liberating because when I first started doing the research, I had in mind a certain book. And then I found the book that I thought I was supposed to write about 6 months into my research process. And that completely messed me up because then I had to go back to square one. And I think 2 or 3 times I found the book I thought I was writing until I actually let the book that I was supposed to write come out, if you will. And so that was challenging and humbling for me personally, because I write a lot and I'm an advisor, so I'm supposed to know stuff. And it's hard to say, I don't know. And it's hard as a white person who's in positions of responsibility to open yourself up to other folks with other perspectives and really say, we need to co-create a new answer that will evolve in between us, and that I don't have the answer and Edgar doesn't have the answer, but I'm pretty sure that somewhere in between our relationship and the future, the answer exists, and we have to lift it up and discover it and celebrate the creation of that process.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, terrific, Jed. Thank you so much. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here into a couple two-pronged questions for both of you. So a lot of folks have been asking around about action steps. Edgar, you mentioned, policy and theft. Jed, you've mentioned many times, moving money into the right places might not be enough. You have to, do other things, decision-making, leadership, language. A lot of folks too have been saying, what are the practical first steps for me, for us right now? How can we move large chunks of capital to communities of color? how do we manage the inevitable backlash of doing that? And then in general, just really curious if you could both talk on the personal level. So there's the political and the sort of policy related actions, but on the personal level, how do we extend that circle of healing, to use your image, Edgar? And Jed, how do we deepen this collective understanding and therefore action that you spoke so beautifully in your book around that great chain of being, that we're all connected? How do we do both things? And just some thoughts from both of you. And I guess, Jed, we'll start with you. Both a personal take of what we can do now, and then some policy and financial pieces that folks can walk away with.
So one of my favorite Buddhist sayings is, don't just do something, sit there. And I think it's really important that we stop. We are so used to having the answers, to reacting, to saying what we need is a new fund, and here's the structure, and here are the metrics, and here's the term sheet. This is how we have to go, right? I've been a part of this impact community for, 30 some years in terms of the finance part of it. And I have to say, on the one hand, the response to the COVID crisis has been really inspiring to see how many people come forward with new ideas, new ways to tweak things, new accommodations to the current circumstance. And at the same time, I was really disappointed because, living in, we were locked down about 3 blocks south of the field hospital in Central Park. And to sit there night after night, just ceaseless sirens, and having friends who lost family, and listening to the public conversation have no reflection at all on what was lost, on what this means, on no pause before acting, I think was a real loss for us in a sense. And so I think that, yes, we need to talk about next steps. We need to talk about deal terms and structure. We know all that, actually. The problem is, I think it's more like Martin Luther King said, that something along the lines that in the absence of spiritual guidance, we will have guided missiles and misguided men. I don't think it's a question of deal structure and term sheets. I think it's a question of intent and purpose and value, and being fully present in this process in a way that blows the existing thinking up and says there's a new way to be in this way. And so I think that's really more of what I'm asking for. I have all faith and confidence that our community will have the right answers, will find the right steps, will learn how to structure capital appropriately for the various shareholders that are involved, the various stakeholders that need to be represented. I am less convinced that we will, as a community, take the time and the opportunity to simply stop.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jed. Edgar?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said earlier, Jed, about this being the work of white people. It really is all of our work. And I often invite folks to remember their original instructions. I think when we look at our own families, all of us, our personal histories, and go back far enough, you will find that there were original instructions about how we are to be and how we are to connect with one another and live in community. And we've lost our way. We've lost, we've all kind of internalized different ways of being. And in the U.S., this is a very young country where we've tried ideas of individualism and whatnot that are not serving us well. So I invite folks to start at home and with your own family story, and dig out and remember where you came from. Remember who your ancestors were and what those original teachings were, and try to embody those. And to have these conversations with your children and with your family. I think it's very easy for a lot of us to go to work and to talk about equity and to, apply these things in the office, but it is so hard for us to have the conversations with our own family and with our own children. So we have got to start at home. If the only time you're talking about equity or justice or any of that stuff is at work, then that's just not enough. Like, we've got to be talking about it all the time. So I say start there. And and I think that while, we don't have the luxury to just learn and go on those journeys without acting. So you can do both. And I say often you can learn by giving. And if you want to be in right relationship with Indigenous communities, with communities of color, get into a relationship where you're supporting in a way that feels good to everyone. And know that there is a philanthropic infrastructure of POC-led organizations and intermediaries that have the relationships, have the ideas and solutions. We just don't have the capital. You know, I have an intermediary right now where I can deploy millions of dollars. I just don't have the capital. I know where the money needs to go, right? So, you know, I think in our work, just really understanding, yes, personal transformation work that needs to happen, but also through the use of money, how can we build wealth in communities of color and like get ourselves out of the equation to allow folks to move forward in a self-determined way? So that's what I would offer.
That was great.
Edgar, Jed, thank you both so much for such a deeply honest and rich and beautiful conversation. It was really inspiring, and the chat is alive with lots of gratitude. So thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. We are all going to take a quick break, a 10-minute break, and we will all come back in 10 minutes for this exciting theological response panel to this incredible discussion.